Hi, it's Victor Perton, that optimism man, and I am ecstatic because today I have Jessica Koehler, and Jessica is a fantastic columnist on the virtues of optimism, the passions of optimism, and how to be more optimistic. She lives in Utah, so I'm speaking in the morning and she's speaking in the evening, and she's a faculty member in the University of Arizona Global Campus Psychology Department. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. So I think, as I've told you, no one visits the Centre for Optimism without being asked that key question. What makes you optimistic, Jessica? Is it life experience? Is it faith? Is it mindset? Is it your research?
Well, I will have to start off by saying I am definitely not a natural optimist, which I'm curious to know if you are. I am someone who kind of went through childhood and was known as like a worrier. So I have had to sort of flip the script on myself through both lots of education in the field of psychology and becoming immersed in like positive psychology, stoicism, and life experiences. I would say it's both like study in psychology and life experiences that combine together to make me a learned optimist. I would say the first half of my life and sort of more of my natural inclinations aren't to be optimistic, and like my family of origin, I didn't have a lot of good examples of that. But I've had to sort of focus really hard to go against that. But I feel like I'm really successful at it. Like, even though it's something that's like been hard for me to transition to, I feel like I am a good example of someone who can go from sort of being that worrier, anxious type of child, teenager, early adult to becoming a really optimistic individual. So.
But worried optimist Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, called herself a worried optimist. You know, she was optimistic, but she had a lot to worry about. So you're actually following a great leadership pattern, Jessica.
Well, I like to be compared to her. That's great. But I just think it's such an interesting, I think optimism and a lot of characteristics like this that are aspects of our personality, many times we believe, and there are underlying genetic components, right? There are genetic aspects to who we are, but that doesn't mean they're set in stone and we can't change them to be, more of one way versus another that we want to be. And, I think that's just so exciting. It makes me like happy to think that we have the free will to like change kind of who we are to be more in line with what our ideals are, our core values. So I think it's like a great thing to be able to say, well, I wasn't necessarily always this way. I was able to become this way, and so can other people, right? So I think I'm optimistic just about that. So.
But it's great leadership. You asked me earlier whether I'm a natural optimist. I'm not sure. I remember Nelson Mandela saying, I am an optimist. I don't know whether it's nature or nurture. I know it's just keeping your face to the sun and one foot stepping in front of the other. And for me, I sort of look back over 4 generations of people who lived on the Baltics, who were invaded by the Swedes and then the Russians and the Soviets, and my parents were refugees. My grandmother was in the Gulag. My grandfather was tortured to death. But they kept going, and they told their stories with humor. So even though they'd been through the toughest stuff, the storytelling was almost always with a hint of humor. He shot at me, but he must have been drunk because he missed me. And so for me, when I look at that, my grandmother was in the Gulag for 12 years, and yet towards the end of the Soviet Union, she was physically very frail, but she took part in the Baltic Way, the million people joining hands across Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And then she said to me, I will outlive communism. And she did. So my grandmother, my mother, their persistence in the face of really the toughest life experiences, I think, ingrained it in me. So there's probably a bit of genetics. There's
Yeah,
also a big part of the storytelling and the ability to stay humorous in the
right.
face of tragedy.
Well, it sounds like you have both a combination of probably the underlying genetic influence and the environmental influence by the storytelling. And so you have a good combination. Um, I may have the opposite. So I've had to really, I wouldn't say that my family has been through quite as much adversity for sure, but still, there's still a lot of, I would say more pessimism and stuff like in terms of viewpoints that I've had to sort of rebel against.
Yeah.
But wow, I mean, that reminded me a lot of, do you know Viktor Frankle and some of the,
Indeed.
like that sort of like getting through that time and like really focusing on what you can control and how you respond to what's going on in your environment. Wow, that's just a really amazing story and kind of interesting to where you've gotten to based on that family history for sure. But
That reference to Viktor Frankl, of course, I've actually written an essay on the similarities between Viktor Frankl and, in fact, women's literature of last century, Pollyanna. So Pollyanna, goes through, she's orphaned, she's crippled, and she plays the glad game. In whatever circumstances she's in, she tries to look for some light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, Viktor Frankl, in Tragic Optimism, says it doesn't matter whether you're in a concentration camp or in the beauties of Utah or me here in Melbourne. He says, just do your best.
Right, right. And I mean, I just was having this conversation with my younger child today, right? His adversity that he was going through wasn't quite like Viktor Frankl's, but I was trying to explain to him in this moment, you have the ability, right? That whole like stimulus, and you get to choose what your response is to that adversity. And I think just teaching kids that it's hard. And again, I think there's underlying inclinations and personality variables that make it more challenging for some people than others, right? Totally think that that's true. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and that we can't all become more optimistic, and it can help us in different ways. But yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about some of these people through history that have just been through things that none of us can imagine, but come out. I mean, Nelson Mandela is an amazing example of that, right? Like I was just reading one of his quotes again and talking to my other child about it, right? Like, I think it's something, I'll probably mess it up, but like, I never lose. I either win or I learn, right? Right. And, we're working on with our older son, like dealing with like just that fear of failure, right? And, if you can reframe it as, it's not going to be a failure, it's a learning experience, right? If you can reframe things in that way, then you don't have that fear, a fear of something happening. You're like, okay, I'm either going to do really well or I'm going to learn something and how to do better the next time. And I just think that's like powerful, right? Like, it's just like a powerful thing. I don't have to be worried about that failure. So.
In some senses, it's why older people tend to be more optimistic, because we've had the experiences. We missed out on being class captain, or we missed out on that job application, or we lost that job, or our business went bad. But the sun still rises the next morning. It doesn't matter how embarrassing we were the day before. Everyone else has forgotten it, and the sun still rises.
Right. Harder to have that perspective when you're 14 and 17, right? So as a parent, and trying to impart that wisdom, but it doesn't necessarily stick. Sometimes I think you have to go through some of those things yourself, but doesn't mean I stop trying to impart the wisdom.
Mine are 19 and 17, so yeah, we're very similar. So you've got a really interesting life story. So for the listeners who don't know you very well, do you want to share some of your story and how it led you to be an advocate for optimism as a source of well-being and happiness?
Sure. As I said, I'm definitely not a natural optimist. I'm very much what, can be called a learned optimist. From my family of origin, I had a very sort of, not as challenging as some, but I went through a very terrible divorce, lots of worrying, lots of stress. And I took on like the worrier sort of mode in my family, and it sort of stuck to become a part of my identity, unfortunately. And this like family turmoil probably pushed me into becoming a psychologist, right? Because I really wanted to understand human behavior and emotions. And sadly, when I first started my study of psychology, most of it was on like the negative aspect. Psychology throughout most of its history has been a bit negative, right? Like focused on pathology and diagnosis. And I went into being what's in the United States called a school psychologist. So a big focus on education. And I was really interested in helping kids learn. But when I became a practitioner in the schools, so much of it was like very negative and about diagnosing people with different disorders. And I think it, after even just like my first year, it really connected that this isn't really what I wanted to be doing. And so I started, kind of looking into other areas of psychology. And then we had our first son and then our second son, and I kind of took a break from being a practitioner and sort of did some sort of autodidactic learning for several years and really shifted focus, learned more about Martin Seligman's research. I first heard of him when he talked about, I don't know if you may have heard about learned helplessness, when he did some terrible experiments on dogs, right? And he, basically showed that people can become helpless based on their experiences where they don't even try anymore, people and dogs and animals. And, then from that research, he really shifted and started studying, more aspects of like, human well-being and became really immersed in the field of positive psychology. And, as I learned more about positive psychology, I'm like, this is it. This is what I'm interested in. I'm really more interested in how we can use our understanding of human behavior, well-being, understanding emotions, and really focus on the positive aspects, rather than focusing on just the negative diagnosis. This is what's wrong with you. There's nothing we can really do. I think that psychology can do a lot for people especially in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, and helping people reframe and restructure their ideas. So I would say like later in life, a little bit, I became super excited about positive psychology, sort of shifted focus a lot from that earlier training I had. And also I think having kids really just changed it changed sort of my outlook on the world, my experiences, and not just like study within psychology, but I became more aware of like stoicism, right? And the idea of focusing on what you control, reading like a lot about Marcus Aurelius and stuff like that. And all of the things combined together, like my environmental experiences and, my own study. And so over time, I think it sort of shifted me to deliberately change my mindset from sort of that early worrier to being, this sort of more optimistic person. And, I think now where I am today as, a professor of psychology, and I love it, teaching undergraduate and graduate students and trying to help them connect the science of psychology to their lives, right? Like really seeing how it matters in their everyday lives. And that's what I do at Psychology Today. I consider myself a bit of a psychological generalist. I write about a bunch of different topics. Optimism is one of them, with the goal of helping people realize how like psychology can help you in so many different aspects of life, from relationships to learning to just understanding your own cognitive biases, stuff like that. And I think that's sort of where I am today, just really trying to proselytize how much, especially positive psychology, can help you, improve your well-being for the long run.
Well, you're doing a great job on that front because, as you know, I follow your articles and I love them.
Oh,
I
thank you.
first came across you as an advocate for rational optimism. So what is rational optimism, and are you a rational optimist? And I have to make a confession here. I'm a radical optimist and my gender pronouns are Pollyanna optimist. So I'm really interested in you rational optimists.
So yes, I am definitely a rational optimist. I am very rational in general. And I think that comes from sort of that earlier worrier, like being, very analytical in my thinking about different issues. And I think what rational optimism, it's the belief that we should acknowledge that there are challenges, right? We're not going to ignore them. We're going to say that there are challenges, there are difficulties, both personally and in the world, right? But we recognize the human potential for improvement, right? We can utilize evidence-based action. We can look at history and say, like, human ingenuity has helped to get us this far. We're going to keep going, right? Like, we can look at the past and say, wow, we've learned so much. Let's figure out how we can move forward and learn more. It's like balancing that hope with some realism, right? And it's understanding that even though we have sort of an uncertain future, I think we're going to progress forward, right? We're going to progress forward because of like, we have so many amazing human beings in the world. And I think I like to think about things at like a macro and a micro level. Like, you can easily open up social media and be like, oh my goodness, this is just what is going on, get really down, and I that can happen to me too. And I have to reframe and say, we're going to get through this. We're going to figure it out. We're going to figure out how to move forward. Right. I think sometimes I'm jealous of people that are just more naturally or extreme radical optimists without necessarily having to try. I think there can be some problems with that though. I mean, it depends on the situation. Of course, there's lots of nuance. I think there's a lot we can say for learning from setbacks, right? Like, I have some different discussions with people in our family that I'm someone who, if we do have a difficult issue, I always like to go back and think, what could we have done differently so we can change things for the future. Some people don't like to do that. They just don't even want to go backwards and like ruminate over anything. To me, that's a positive way to be, because I'm going to take that information from the past, use that evidence and move forward and learn from that setback. So I think rational optimism sort of provides like a sustainable foundation to be able to deal with the actual realistic problems that we have, but in sort of a very hopeful way. So, but I'm jealous of people that are maybe not quite so analytical and rational all the time.
Yeah, I like Hans Rosling, his book Factfulness, the Swedish doctor, and very like you, this very rational attitude and explaining to people why they should be optimistic, that march of human progress. And I have a friend, Matthias Sundin, who is called the Angry Optimist, and he's on the Swedish Prime Minister's AI Commission. And, with the idea of not worrying so much about the downside of AI, but how Sweden can harness it, for the benefit of the nation. So if we come back to rational optimism, one of the things that really annoys me is when I see articles talking about toxic positivity or blind or unrealistic positivity. So when I go back to your article, Rational Optimism Across Life's Domains and Harnessing the Power of Positive Thinking with a Realistic Approach, you mentioned that optimism's benefits have, in many areas of life. So how does rational optimism enhance our resilience in difficult times?
So I think that rational optimism kind of, being able to acknowledge that there are difficulties out there rather than just fully having blind positivity. But acknowledging it without getting overwhelmed, right? Not getting consumed by those problems. It helps you be able to have like the ability to say, okay, I'm going to focus on solutions. Being solution focused helps, in my opinion, build that resilience, right? Because it's about finding ways to adapt to challenges. Because if you just have complete blind positivity about something and don't really consider that there could be negative outcomes, and then those negative outcomes come, you might get more disillusioned, right? And so, having this rational component to, this optimistic attitude gives you more of an ability to like we were talking about, be resilient in the face of these difficulties. Because let's be clear, whether it's at that, the macro or the micro level, we're constantly having difficulties. And if we don't at least acknowledge those in some way and try to think about ways to, to develop solutions for them, it can backfire. Sometimes it won't backfire. Sometimes that positivity will get you through there and it will be absolutely successful, but there will be times when it won't. And I think for certain people, like again, with that interaction with personality and stuff, if they have that blind positivity and aren't really thinking about the potential negative outcomes for some people, that can be really problematic and just, kind of make them a little bit less optimistic in the future. And so I think having a more rational focus can be really, really good. I think that it's, again, it's like that learning from setbacks, as I was always saying that I was just talking about with our older son. It's like seeing setbacks as just things that happen in life, not as failures too. Like, I think if you frame things in that manner, that, you're going to have things that are probably going to come up. And when they come up, it's how you react to them. It kind of changes the whole attitude towards the potential difficulties, in my opinion. If you don't even address those difficulties, I think that can be problematic, right? But if you ahead of time are saying, okay, we may have setbacks, and those setbacks could be really challenging, but how we react to those setbacks, is what really matters.
I can turn then to young people. You have an expertise in optimism in the young. You're teaching young adults. You've got teenage children, as I do. I was lucky enough the year before last to be in an audience with the Dalai Lama. And he said this, he said, a more optimistic attitude is key to the care of teenagers and children through this pandemic. So it was at the tail end of the pandemic. And he said, a pessimistic attitude is very bad. Helping children to stay hopeful and still optimistic despite the difficulties is very important. So from your perspective, giving advice to parents and grandparents to help our teenagers stay optimistic, what's your view on the best thing we can do? I mean, the Dalai Lama says we've got to model it. You can't tell teenagers to be optimistic. We've got to demonstrate it. What's your view?
Well, number one, what an amazing experience for you to be a part of. But I mean, I would definitely agree with the Dalai Lama. Number one would be modeling it. Like with so many things with our kids, we can say one thing, but they're watching, right? And actually, psychology tells us a lot about social learning theory and how what we're doing, our children are watching and they are going to often repeat for better or for worse. So number one would be modeling optimism. I think really encouraging open communication is another one, right? Let teenagers, you have them, what it can be like, let them vent, right? Let them talk, let them, really try to foster and create a situation where they feel safe to talk to you. And as they're talking to you or going down into this dark place, as a parent or grandparent or, caregiver, gently guide them, right? Gently guide them in their conversation to sort of more hopeful solutions, right? Another thing, as we were talking about earlier on, was Viktor Frankle and stuff like that, helping them think about focusing on what aspects of a situation they can control, right? If you start contemplating so many things in this world, there's very few things we can control. And I think sometimes when we get overwhelmed, if we can really bring it back in and say, well, I can't control this particular global issue at this point in time, but you know what? I can take care of myself and try to be healthy and eat a little better and get some 20 to 30 minutes of exercise a day, right? Those kind of things. So that's really important, I think, especially for teenagers, to help bring them back, because they tend to like catastrophize and get really anxious. Not all, but many, many do. You can also do stuff like highlighting stories of resilience. For your family, it sounds like you have some amazing stories of resilience, right? Like talking about your ancestors and what they went through and how they overcame it. There's so many, biographies, helping kids connect with like literature that really kind of tells those stories in detail about how people have overcome, amazing adversities. I'm always a big proponent of gratitude, right? Having, especially for teenagers, sometimes it spirals down to that negativity, like having them really like kind of reflect. I was just thinking about this within our own family, like trying to maybe make some sort of time once a week or every single day that we talk a little bit about kind of the things that, not just at Thanksgiving, which is a holiday here in the United States, that we talk about, really talking about things like what are you feeling grateful for? Really reflect on it. Because I think as you, even just thinking about it, but more so talking, communicating, or journaling about it, can have a really strong effect when you start really trying to say, wow, look at all of these amazing things in my life. And it kind of shifts your mindsets. I think like during times like the pandemic and stuff, it was probably really important for children of all ages to have somewhat of a routine. Sometimes when things are so kind of crazy in the world, helping your kids by creating more safety and routine can be really good. And I think, as I was mentioning earlier too, limiting social media to some extent negative, right? I'm not someone who's like, don't ever let your kids on social media or watching, but it's so easy to get pulled down into these spirals of negativity. And I find myself at like 11 o'clock at night checking X, I guess it used to be Twitter. And I'm like, well, reading these comments and I'm like, this is terrible. This is toxic for my brain, right? I have the ability to say, this is not good for me. But talking to your teenagers about that. But it isn't just social media. I don't know what your news is like in Australia, but even our mainstream media, it's unbelievably negative. Like, and I think sometimes that is really problematic for these, developing brains. More and more neuroscience research is showing like kids' brains probably aren't fully developed till like 25 years old, right? So we need to protect those developing brains and realize that overwhelming negativity probably has more of an effect on our children and teenagers, and a lot of us have the ability to, as adults, to, although I think it affects a lot of adults too, but I think that as parents and grandparents, we need to kind of maybe watch that a little bit if you feel like they're being exposed to too much just negativity. It's amazing to me the amount of negativity I see, especially on social media, and but it's not even just that. I was realizing, I think sometimes there are some well-meaning educational tools that are out there, curricula that are out there, and in some ways, I noticed our younger son, when we talked about it, he's very, very, there's a great thing about being educated and understanding about things like what's happening with our climate. But I think sometimes the way that it's presented to kids can be terrifying, right? And so and you have to know your kids a little bit. And so he's, I think, probably internalized it a bit more than I would like to see. And so we've had to have conversations like what we can do, and that, the world's not going to end tomorrow. But, sometimes I think well-meaning things by adults, we don't really fully understand the effects they can even have on kids.
Yeah, I think I had this argument yesterday with a leader in the PR industry, and he, of course, was blaming social media. But social media only is a mouthpiece or a loudhailer for the conventional news. So if you switch on the news, it is bleak. Steven Pinker, the head of psychology at Harvard, says in the 1970s, the news was 50-50 good, bad. Today, it's 95% bad. And if we go back to Rosling, he can show that even the world's elites think that the world is much worse than it is. And so I think we really have to reduce our consumption of conventional news. And recently I was with my 17-year-old daughter, and we were doing a father-daughter road trip from Toronto to New York, and we then flew to San Francisco, and that was in July. And I listened to Canadian radio, I listened to American radio, PBS, Fox, and then I switched on the Australian news. It sounded like we were a third world hellhole. Our news is so vile. And it's every car crash, every stabbing, because it's a country in which there's actually very little violence. It's a very safe country, a healthy country, an affluent country. However, our journalists and their editors have convinced themselves that the only news is bad news. And it's shocking. And a recent study by GHD, which is one of the world's biggest infrastructure advisories, actually, when they asked a question on optimism about infrastructure and leadership, they called it the Anglosphere. The English-speaking countries were bottom of the pile. Australia, Canada, England, New Zealand, the US, somehow we have talked ourselves into a bleak way of looking at the world. And, I look at even my own literature. When I was a child, it was Enid Blyton and the Faraway Tree and the Famous Five and the Secret Seven. And then it was Tarzan and it was Biggles. It was adventurous, boyish stuff, where you had crisis and heroism or bravery and a solution. And yet today, if you look at the English literature curriculum, it's overwhelmingly bleak and dystopian. So instead of Star Trek, we have Hunger Games. And
That's
you know,
true.
it has to have an effect on kids' brains. So look, can I take you then
Totally.
to the OECD has recognized this, you know, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is, you know, the 22 most advanced economies. They say we should be explicitly teaching optimism in schools. So how do you think rational optimism can be integrated into education, both at the school and university level? And what role can the school or the university play in fostering that optimism amongst young people, rather than encouraging the occupation of campuses by those who think most bleakly about our own governments?
It is fascinating just thinking about just from the time, I mean, I'm 47, and from the time I was in school to now, and how um sort of negatively focused so many things, and negatively about, and I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but I feel like it's very negative about the US. Like kids are learning very negative things about their own country all the time, which of course there are very negative things that happened in our history that we should totally be educating our children on. But I think that that shouldn't be the main focus. And right now, I feel like the balance at one point in time was probably too much like everything's amazing, we're the most amazing country. And now we've kind of flipped the script to so much the other way. It needs to be more of a balance, in my opinion, that we need to like be realistic about some of the things that happened, but also realize that there are many amazing aspects of, I'm just going to speak about the United States and our history, right? But thinking about how we can integrate optimism directly, or indirectly into education is really fascinating. And I think when I was mentioning before, just even the ideas of like within different subject areas, like literature, like providing stories, having within our curricular materials stories of hope and optimism, people that have overcome difficulties in the face of adversity and have come out on the other side really successful, really focusing on positive stories. Can like that, those narratives can have a huge effect for kids, right? Like even within science and stuff like that, thinking about it, like just helping helping kids understand like the difficulty of problems that we've solved throughout history using science, and how at different points in time we didn't think we would be able to figure out this difficult issue, but look, we did, right? I'm blanking on a particular scientific discovery, but like different points in history where we've realized, okay, this is the big problem, and we've really focused on it as a country or as a an organization, and we've really figured something out, right? Like focusing on those success stories. I mean,
And
even
one basic is water. You know, you look at the sewering of the United Kingdom and London. You know, they were having plagues of cholera and diphtheria and the like. And finally, someone figured out it was because the sewage was mixing with the drinking water. And then they did this enormous, rapid project of building the sewers and separating the drinking water from the excrement. And of
right.
course, you know, if you look at the development of London and the United Kingdom, and you look at the same thing in New York, I was recently up at the Thousand Islands on the St. Lawrence River, and every summer, you know, the middle class and the elites of New York and Boston would head up to the St. Lawrence River because it was clean, the air was clean, whereas New York and Boston were just hellholes of stink and sewage. And again, you know, you look at something as basic as piped water and piped sewage. It's remarkable, and it's the stories of a few women and men who actually figured out what the problem is and solved it. And you see the same with antibiotics and the like. And of course, these days it's so basic to kids they don't even think about. You flush
Right,
the toilet, I'm just happy it goes. I turn on the tap,
right.
I'm just happy I drink. But I don't understand the miracle that actually makes that happen.
Well, yeah, no, it's that human ingenuity, right? Like that having understand realizing that we have all this brain power. And I'm someone who's sort of, as you're speaking about the other gentleman, I'm an AI optimist, right? Like how can we use it to enhance human well-being? I'm at odds a bit with some other professors who are not very happy with the use of AI, but it made me think about, have you ever read the story about like the first doctor who realized that washing your hands was really what was
Yeah.
going to keep women from dying in childbirth. And he was made fun of, right? Like I think he died like a pauper or something. But like those sorts of stories of like these people with very simplistic things who made massive changes in the world for the betterment of humanity, right? Like, so going back to that question about what can we do within education, tell those stories, right? Tell those stories about how we've overcome all these obstacles, help students understand, where we've come from. And I think there's this overwhelming focus, like we were kind of touching upon, like learning about history in general and how things used to be, to understanding how much better things are across just about every domain. I'm not going to say every domain, but most, I think, is just absolutely an imperative part of education, which I know in the United States it's lacking. Like I used to be a school psychologist in public schools, and kids' understanding of our history is not good. Like on average, I'm on average. Like there's amazing, there are examples where that's not true, but I think we shifted focus so much on like reading and math and like really focusing on helping kids read, which of course is extraordinarily important, but we lost out on some of the like history and social studies and science. And I think those aspects of our curriculum are just absolutely imperative. So we understand what, like when I see like teenagers like, oh my gosh, life is so much worse now than it's ever been. I'm like, have you read about the Dark Ages? Like let's see how much human progress we've had. But even beyond like embedding stuff directly, embedding curricular materials, just teaching coping mechanisms, having awareness of emotional intelligence and positive self-talk, just those kind of things, helping kids understand conflict resolution. I'm a big proponent of kids learning, like our older son was really into debate. He's really into politics and international relations and stuff. And he learned a lot by, learning how to debate and having to come up with evidence to support his ideas and not thinking that someone who disagrees with you is automatically your enemy. Sometimes, nowadays we have a really hard time with having debates where we don't automatically go to, you're just a terrible person, right? Like, oh no, this is my opinion and I have this evidence to back it up. And I want to listen to your opinion with an open mind and hear your evidence to back it up. So that's, I think, a really important thing. Just the whole idea of helping kids learn to, if they're having irrational, really negative thoughts about something, helping them understand they can reframe their thinking, promoting, I don't know if you're familiar with Carol Dweck is a famous psychologist from Stanford University, and came up with this whole idea of growth mindsets, right? That helping kids really develop growth mindsets. And really, one of the ways to do that is really focusing on, giving praise for things that are not just the outcome, like working hard and working towards a goal and realizing you have the ability to get better at something. Again, normalizing mistakes, like within school settings, realizing if you don't do well on a test, it's not the end of the world. Again, I'm not failing. I'm just learning. I'm learning how I can do better the next time, and probably connecting more things to sort of real world problem solving, I think would be another really important way, especially like the high school and collegiate level. I know within my classes, I'm always trying to help connect, psychological concepts to the students' sort of everyday life. So they understand when we're talking about confirmation bias or cognitive dissonance, what are potential examples of that they've experienced in their own lives, stuff like that.
Yeah, I teach great public policy, and sometimes I get the feedback from the class that says, look, the materials were great, Vic, but those little stories, the little asides, the experience you can share where you went through a mistake and, it didn't work and you tried again a different way is what they love. So today I read a survey that in the context of the American election, showed a large gap between young people's personal optimism and their optimism towards America. And as I wrote in my column, it's exactly the same for Australia, although we're starting from a lower base. Less kids would say that they are optimistic for themselves, and less kids would say they're optimistic for their country. So Is that negativity about the future of the world, we've talked a little bit about it in terms of climate change, is that the locus of control? I can control my own life and I can control my own decisions, or is it a cynicism towards leadership, or is it both?
Well, first, I'm happy if you're seeing something that's showing that teenagers, young people today are actually showing more optimism about their individual lives, because I think that there's been a bit of a trend the other direction. What's her name? Jean Twenge. I think she's a professor from the University of San Diego. She's done some research showing that a lot of this was probably like 5 to 10 years ago. So it probably is like late millennials, early Gen Zs, really were having not having much of an internal locus of control about things, feeling that everything was out of their control and not feeling good about the future. So if we're seeing a shift, at least in that aspect, I think that's positive. But understanding the dichotomy between the individual optimism versus sort of a more national or global pessimism, I mean, I think there's probably multiple factors. I do think that the negativity being experienced within the educational institutions, the social media, the regular media, all of those things. I just think that there's like a perfect storm of negativity happening about the world in a time where it shouldn't be, right? Like if you do step back and you look at statistics about world hunger, right? About violence. I know there was a bit of an uptick after COVID, I know in the United States, but in general, like how violent society is.
Hmm.
Now, of course, there are pockets of the world where that's different, but in general, we're seeing improvements across so many different areas at the same time that we're seeing such negativity about these issues. Somehow we have to proselytize more, right? People like you and I about how, like, how do we help young people see that while, there are still people that are dealing with some pretty significant issues, we have come such a long way, and technology is helping us come even farther. To me, I'm like so excited about the fact that in Africa and all these different places in the world where they're going to have internet capabilities and be able to be connected and have access to education, and just even in the United States, the ability to connect with so many different learning opportunities for free is unbelievable. I mean, I don't know if you guys have stuff like, I mean, you can, here in the United States, you can go to a public library. If you don't have, most people have internet at home, have some sort of access, right? But even if you don't have that, you can go to a public library. You can log in for free and take classes from some of the best institutions in this country, right? Through Coursera or these other programs. It's unbelievable to me what we have access to. And so in this time to have so much negativity, it's almost like a global cognitive dissonance or something. It doesn't make sense to me, right? We should be optimistic about the future, but for some reason, the way that things are framed, I think within our media and our education system has created the opposite. And I think, but I'm optimistic that we could turn it around, right? Like I think
You and I and others. And I teach
right.
people, I've done it in prison elsewhere. In Australia, the typical greeting is, "G'day, how are you?" Similar to the French, similar to the Austrians and the Germans. The typical answer is not bad or not too bad. So it's not good or I feel great or the like. It's not bad or not too bad. And so we ran the experiment firstly in prison, in fact, with some of the toughest prisoners. But I now run it out to school kids. And I say, get rid of that question, "How are you?" and replace it with something like, "What's been the best thing in your day?" Or "What's been the best thing in your day so far?" And the feedback I get from everyone who's adopted it is it changes their lives for the better. And it's just a little change. Instead of saying a general "How are you?" which people don't even listen to the answer, people have got to think when you say, "What's been the best thing in your day?"
Well, the whole idea of change your thoughts, change your world, it seems so like trite, but it's so profound, right? Like you can shift your thinking. You can change how you think about a terrible situation that's happened to you. It is And when you really internalize that belief that, like, even if something really challenging happens to me, I have the power, the ability to respond in a certain way, like it feels like a superpower. It sounds silly, but like I don't have to react in the way that everyone thinks I would, right? Like I can react and be like, I'm gonna learn from this, I'm gonna grow from this, I'm gonna focus on it this way. And if we can just figure out how to um help more people see that, right? Help more people understand that they have the ability to change their thoughts, reframe their thinking in the face of obstacles. I mean, it's like just like a powerful thing that we could make spread. I think it's just, and I think we can. I think, figuring out the best ways to do that, and it's probably going to be through multiple methods and stuff. But I think there is the ability to do something like that, and I think maybe we've reached, hopefully, I feel like things are shifting a little bit in the United States. I think there is a bit of a people getting tired of the negativity, right? Right. And so hopefully we've reached sort of like this low point where we're going to come back up and start realizing, and maybe there'll be more organizations and educational institutions that will try to reframe things into a more positive way.
Well, I watched an ad from Wrangler jeans today, and they were showing a man getting up in the morning and putting on his jeans, and it was all about morning people wear Wrangler jeans and have optimism. So I was very pleased with that. I posted that on LinkedIn, and it's generated a whole lot of comments. Now, I mean, you evoke optimism and happiness, just, the way you talk and the way you respond. And I know you've studied the physical brain science. So change your thoughts, you actually change your body. And one of the things I read that you wrote said, optimism influences the brain's dopamine system, which plays a key role in motivation and pleasure. When we expect positive outcomes, it triggers a dopamine release, creating a reinforcing cycle of optimism. So how can we intentionally cultivate optimism to activate this dopamine cycle?
So it's kind of this neat reinforcing cycle, and dopamine is playing a key role in a lot of things, right? It makes us feel good. And so we kind of all crave it. And sometimes we crave it too much, and it does have some connection to problematic addiction behaviors, but we do need dopamine to help us with our well-being and to feel good. And when we kind of, I don't want to say force, but we encourage ourselves to have optimistic thoughts, that initially can trigger that dopamine release that then creates this reinforcing cycle. So like optimistic thoughts lead to positive emotional experiences, which further like your ability and your desire to think more optimistically. So it's like this, you can just start the train going, right? Like start with like, I'm going to think a bit more positively about the situation. And then you start getting a little bit of that dopamine release. And then it like will continue to go as you start feeling better. You're going to start feeling more optimistic, and it'll build upon itself. And I think what's, again, really amazing and is that we can train ourselves, right? Optimism can be cultivated through things like that, changing our thoughts, the cognitive restructuring, mindfulness, being more aware of what we're doing. Like when I'm looking at social media at nighttime at 11:30 at night and I'm reading all these negative comments, and I'm like, okay, I need to just stop doing this, right? Like this is, just really catching yourself in the moment when you realize that you're doing things that aren't going to contribute to your well-being. Stop, right? That gratitude again, stepping back and saying, I'm gonna sort of talk, and not even just talk about it, but just even like if you're by yourself and you're starting to go down this like negative spiral, stop and think about things that you're grateful for,
Yeah.
right? And that can just start the release of the dopamine.
I
And
do that in cafes and restaurants. It used to drive my kids nuts. I would always, thank the waitresses effusively. If the kitchen was open or partly open, stick my head in the window and say thanks to the chef. And then if it's a cafe, to say thank you to the barista. And the other day, my son, who's now 19, and living in another city, we had coffee in a cafe. And of course, he saw me doing it again. He said, Dad, a few years ago, you would have embarrassed me. Now I get it. And so it is that modeling, if we do, like I lift the barista by going and saying thank you and complimenting them on their coffee art or the taste of the coffee, or the chef's got a new salad on the menu. They love to hear someone say, God, I really like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, having your son, that's like the goal, right? Right there. That's amazing. But that brings me back to Martin Seligman's he has a quote that's something akin to the greatest boost to your own well-being is performing a kindness to someone else.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, how many times have you ever had in your life the opposite though? Right? Like where you've done something, you're like, oh, I wasn't so nice, and then it makes you feel terrible. Realize that, right? Learn from it. We all make mistakes, and realize that complimenting. I'm one of those overly like thankful. Oh my gosh, it's amazing food. I do the same thing. Like I'm that way. I love being that way. And sometimes I think my kids are a little embarrassed too. But I don't think that most people realize how those small, simple acts of kindness in everyday life truly make a difference. Especially you don't know what people are going through. Someone could be going through a really terrible day, some sort of situation where they're really distraught, and just that small little kindness can just really boost them. And it not only does it boost them, I mean, it is altruistic, but it's also selfish because it boosts us, right? Like it really makes us feel better. So yeah.
But altruistic hedonism, I think it was referred to in the 1920s. Yeah, the other day I was in New York with my daughter, and she wanted to go shopping on Fifth Avenue, and I wanted to walk down to the UN building, and it was 5 blocks. And I smiled and said hello to everyone I passed. I had 12 conversations in those 5 blocks. And even in a tough city like New York, where people don't tend to look at other people or smile, it just demonstrated to me that ability to smile and say hello to someone lifts them, it lifts you. Now, come to leadership. You've talked about Martin Seligman and Carol and others. Thinking about your own life, who have been the positive leaders in your life? And do you want to share who they are and how they've impacted on you?
Well, I definitely think about these things in a somewhat of an analytical way, right? As I was saying, because I think all types of human beings throughout history, while many of them have many amazing qualities, they all had different flaws, right? So I say this with like certain aspects of leaders that have really stuck with me. I mean, I grew up Gen X in the US, and I will say like Martin Luther King Jr. and like the whole idea of judging people by the content of their character, um like that, and like hearing his speeches, and like obviously had a huge effect on me. A big fan, like when I go back and listen to I love going back and listening to like historical speeches of presidents in the United States, um and like just some of the speeches by John F. Kennedy Jr. John F. Kennedy, sorry, not John F. Kennedy Jr. Were just it's just amazing how hopeful he was. I mean, that talk about optimism, like the eloquence and the optimism he had, and it's just terribly sad, obviously, what happened, but the optimism he had for the United States, I'd say especially those kind of speeches. And I definitely, I'm a someone who cares a lot about the environment, and we do lots of hiking and go to national parks and stuff like that all the time. We're big into doing that with our family. We camp a lot. So I'm a big fan of Teddy Roosevelt, and like listening to some of his earlier speeches. Now, again, all of those people I named had their own personal flaws, right? So I don't want to say I fully embrace all aspects of them, but like a lot of what Teddy Roosevelt, he helped create the national park system, and some of his ideas about leadership. I mean, that's just a few. There's many other psychologists that like you said, Martin Seligman and other. I wrote a book about the French psychologist Jean Piaget, and his ideas were profound in terms of child cognitive development and understanding how just children unfold in terms of these different stages and cognition, and understanding how children aren't just little adults. Like he really helped us see that kids are fundamentally viewing the world in a different way. And he's definitely someone that I look to as, very inspirational in terms of who he was. But I just in general, like, find inspiration in leaders who balance sort of that they had the leadership and the ambition, but also had compassion, right? And despite their human flaws, which they all had, right? Just like myself, right? So I wouldn't say I have like one person or even just a few that I fully embrace and I'm like, they were that I look to, but like looking to different aspects of different leaders throughout history, and even in the present day. So
Yeah, we don't need to be perfect. We don't, and none of us are. Thinking back to the Kennedys, one of my favorite quotes at the funeral of Robert Kennedy, and his brother Teddy Kennedy said, "My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it." And then he said, as he said, some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and say, why not? And I love that. That sort of, and you saw it in Clinton a little bit, with that sort of Fleetwood Mac, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. No, that sort of touching the future. Kennedy, we will be at the moon by the end of the decade. And we were.
right.
We were. So last two questions, because you've been very generous. And so at the Centre for Optimism, we've been researching this for 10 years. And last month, we produced what we call the Optimism Principle. The answer to life's most pressing questions is optimism. And I'm very pleased that we've managed to get 10 years of research down to one sentence. What do you reckon about the Optimism Principle? The answer to life's most pressing questions is optimism.
I think that's a really profound thing to contemplate. I think that I see optimism as a really big part of like our life compass, right? A part that we need to use as a guiding principle, right? Because framing, challenges as opportunities, balancing that hope with realism as well, and cultivating sort of a solution focused mindset, that's going to help us progress forward. So I think like looking at things through a lens of optimism, looking at just about everything, right? Like through a lens of optimism is a great way for us to try to move forward for human progress. And I think it can help us. I've read a long time ago, I was writing some articles about the whole concept of uncertainty, right? Like uncertainty is our greatest fear as human beings. And I think like utilizing that optimism principle and using optimism as like a guiding light for us can help us navigate that uncertainty better, right? Like it can be a way for us to move forward better. And again, that idea that we can utilize optimism and that optimism principle as sort of a force for pushing us towards innovation, pushing us towards more creativity, more ideas, thinking about technology in a positive light rather than doom and gloom. It's going to take over like the Terminator or something. Like I think that thinking about framing most of life's challenges within the framework of optimism is a great way to go about sort of navigating the world. So I love it. I think that's really cool.
Well, thank you. But you said earlier, and you've written, but the direct quote is, the good news is that optimism is not just an innate trait, it's a mindset that can be cultivated. So before we leave off, have you got 2 hot tips and tricks to help people who want to foster and culture their optimism?
I have a few more than that, but I'll go with 2. I would say number 1, challenge those negative thoughts, right? I think, again, there's some people that their immediate, whatever, due to underlying personality variables or whatever, they don't have that problem, that difficulty with having the negativity come to them first. But there are a lot of people that do, that automatically go to sort of a more negative, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? The worst, thinking the worst could potentially happen. Immediately, when you start having that sort of cascade of negativity, challenge it within yourself, right? Restructure your cognitions to be like, okay, I'm not thinking about this in the right way. this is, highly negative and I have no evidence that this is what's going to happen. I need to think about this in a more positive way. So challenging negative thoughts and coming up with different techniques. Different people are going to be able to do that in different ways to different levels of success. But just even thinking about it as you get those negative thoughts, think, okay, I don't want to be feeling this way. I'm gonna reframe, right? That's just like the number one thing. And then that whole focus, the number two would be focusing on what you can control in a situation, right? Really not getting overwhelmed by all of the events outside of your control, because it's so easy to do, right? It's so easy to turn on the news or scroll through social media and be like, all of these things are terrible. And there are some terrible things in the world, right? But there's many things in this world that you can't control, but there are many that you can. And focusing on those aspects of your own life or your own family or within your own little sphere, your little domain of everyday living, focus on those. And, if we all kind of focused on those individual things, collectively, things would get better, right? Like we would all boost our own well-being and collectively the society would be better. So I would say those are the two most important things in terms of challenging negative thoughts and focusing on what you can control.
Brilliant. Jessica, I could go on and on and on. I could talk to you for hours. So I hope we can do this again next year or the year
Definitely.
after. And listeners, I'll add the URLs for Jessica's website, and watch out for her in Psychology Today. And there's just A, such wisdom, and B, such energy you can learn from reading about Jessica, listening to Jessica, and taking up those viewpoints. Challenge people who are pessimistic. Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking in the 1950s, said, don't argue with people unless they're being negative, and then correct them. And I think 100 years on almost, or 70 years on, Jessica's nailed it just as well as that last century bestseller. Jessica, thank you for your time, your wisdom, and what you're doing for the world.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.